not often that I'll go out of my way to play classic games that I missed out on when they were coming out, with the only big exception being the Metal Gear Solid games. But, as a lover of survival horror and the post-apocalypse, it was only a matter of time before I went for this PC classic. S.T.A.L.K.E.R, Call of Pripyat, is the third game in the S.T.A.L.K.E.R franchise, a series of first-person shooters with survival horror and action RPG elements, taking place in an alternate version of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, developed by GSC Game World. It was released for Microsoft Windows in 2009 for Europe and the Commonwealth of Independent States, that is, Russia, Armenia, Ukraine, and other surrounding nations, and re-released in 2010 for North America and Australia. I didn't get my hands on this game until 2015 when my friend Justin bought it for me, and even then, I didn't give it a full playthrough until this year, so I gotta admit, I'm a bit late to this post-apocalyptic party. I knew very little about the series, save for its cult following and uniform hatred for the second game called Clear Sky, so I went in with a very open mind, and let me tell you, I was not disappointed. Call of Pripyat plays like some sort of weird hybrid between Metro Last Light and Fallout New Vegas, with a dash of old PC game quirkiness. It's a great if dated game that's still very fun to play and become immersed in. However, I can confidently say right out the gate, it's not going to be for everybody, so try to keep an open mind too if you can. The S.T.A.L.K.E.R games take place in an alternate reality where the famous Chernobyl meltdown wasn't a catastrophic incident, but a second, much more serious core meltdown and explosion happens in the mid-2000s, bringing not only radioactive fallout, decay, and desolation to the surrounding miles, but also paranormal anomalies, mutated creatures, and plenty of other metaphysical and otherworldly things. The setting players inhabit is called The Zone, which is based on the real-life Chernobyl exclusion zone, but of course in the aforementioned alternate timeline. The in-game world is based on real-life locations, but with plenty of artistic license taken. The world isn't destroyed or anything in this timeline. Instead, the zone is populated by scientists, scavengers, mercenaries, and people called stalkers, who make livelihoods in the zone, collecting, studying, and selling radioactive artifacts found in the nuclear anomalies. The game series is loosely based off of the science fiction novella Roadside Picnic, and a 1979 film adaptation called S.T.A.L.K.E.R, but again, with plenty of artistic license. In Call of Pripyat, you play as Major Alexander Degtyarev, Ukrainian military man and stalker sent on a mission to investigate 5 crashed army helicopters that all went down at the same time under mysterious circumstances. Along the way, you'll explore the zone, fight mutants and bandits, navigate anomalies, and complete main as well as side quests for other stalkers and residents of the zone. It's a very interesting setup and premise for sure, and there's plenty of good mission variety and some genuinely cool moments, twists, and realizations throughout the game. Alright, look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The game is very clearly from 2009, and while it definitely doesn't look like a stepped-in shit on a hot summer day, it's not exactly beautiful either. It holds up fine as long as you're not treating it like some kind of post-apocalyptic simulator 2075. Honestly, it's comparable to something like vanilla Fallout 3, obviously with severely shorter draw distance but with much more detailed textures, and I think the guns in the player's hand look pretty good for the time. I will say in the game's favor that the environment and setting is extremely atmospheric. This is unironically one of the most engrossing and immersive games I've ever played, in no small part to the detail and consistency of the visuals. Walking around in Pripyat at night in the rain was a genuinely harrowing and spooky experience. That being said, the character models, faces, and animations are hilariously dated and jerky, including a bootleg Vladimir Putin and a very funny group of squatting Slavs in radiation suits. This is definitely one of the weaker categories of the game. The sound effects really aren't that good. Lots of them are stock sounds you've heard a million times already, and some of them really don't fit what they're attributed to, like the growling sound that mutated human enemies make. The guns also lack punch, and many of them share sound effects. I really wish they were a little chunkier, because they're a bit lackluster as is. I ended up silencing my primary weapons just because the other sound effects weren't great to listen to. The music was okay. There's really only 1 or 2 forgettable combat tracks, but the sound design is excellent where it really counts, the ambience. Footsteps, wind, rain, everything needed to draw the player into a great feeling of immersion. The voice acting is,
What are you? A statue? If you got something, spill the beans. If not, take a hike.
Yeah, moving on. While the game works very well on a technical level, it has more than its fair share of bugs and glitches. Some of these are purely visual and harmless, but others can actually render the game unbeatable without reloading an older save. I'm very thankful not to have experienced any of these, but from what I've read from others, it would be wise to not delete older saves just in case, but more on that later. Other than that, it runs fine on modern operating systems, and loads up quick too, which is great when you take the sometimes frequent quick saving and quick loading into consideration. Again, more on that later. Okay, we got a lot to cover here. Call of Pripyat has a lot of different gameplay elements. Most of your time will be spent walking from place to place in the zone, fighting mutants and bandits with a wide selection of weaponry. I'm serious though, a lot of this game is spent walking, and while the environments are cool and fun to explore and locations are fun to investigate, sometimes you run into a barbed wire fence or cluster of easily surmountable rubble that you inexplicably cannot traverse, even though it's very obvious that you would be able to in real life. They serve as level boundaries most of the time, and it's pretty frustrating when you see an easily surmountable goal hindered by a lazy prop choice for a playable area boundary. When you kill enemies, you may feel inclined to loot everything you get your hands on, but your inventory weight will fill up very quickly in this game, and most of the things you collect really won't be worth it. It took me about 5 or 6 hours in game to realize that it was not advantageous to loot every weapon I got my hands on, as many of them were in bad condition, and merchants wouldn't buy them from me. And with no easy fast travel, you don't want to be over-encumbered out in the zone for quality of life purposes. Enemies range widely in toughness and lethality. Zombified stalkers shamble toward you, shooting in bursts, while the monolith cultists you fight later in the game fire with lethal accuracy, often from cover. Mutants can be near harmless like the rats, or they can be extreme threats like the telekinetic controller who can knock your gun out of your hands, or the rare pseudo-giant who can take literally hundreds of bullets to kill. There's a great selection of guns to pick and choose from to make your loadout and playstyle unique. Maybe you'll go with a silent pistol and a suppressed machine gun for a stealthy approach, or a sniper for long-range kills, or a shotgun and an SMG for an all-out assault gameplay style. I love the variety of tools it gives the player. You got pistols, shotguns, rifles, machine guns, SMGs, grenade launchers, and a whole lot more. That being said, the early game doesn't have very many good weapon choices, and you can rightfully feel woefully underpowered for the first few hours of the game. The shooting is very competent as long as you're halfway decent with keyboard and mouse, despite the lack of immensely satisfying sound effects that we previously discussed. Guns and armor will deteriorate with use, such as a game like Fallout New Vegas, but unlike New Vegas, Major Degtyarev is not a handyman and cannot repair these items himself. They must be taken to specialists, of which there are only 3 in the game, 1 per each of the 3 areas in the zone. Speaking of the areas, fast travel between them is done via guides, and they must be paid for each time you want to change areas. This system is a bit clunky, and will definitely make players want to optimize their routes between areas to spend as little money as possible simply going back and forth between them. Anyway, because the player can't fix things themselves, this will lead to abandoning weapons and armor simply because they're in bad condition and aren't really worth the money to repair, because it is pretty expensive if they're roughed up. The specialists can also upgrade weapons if they're brought the proper tools to do so, and some of the higher end upgraded weaponry is damn powerful and a lot of fun to use. The third and final specialist is military personnel, like the player, and thus will repair your stuff for free, which kind of devalues the currency a bit, considering you'll probably have a mountain of it stacked up by the end of the game if you play like a frugal asshole like me. Money is gained from quests, selling things you pick up from corpses provided they're in good condition, and especially from collecting and selling artifacts. To get artifacts, you need to find anomalies in the world and carefully traverse the hazards within them. The player can throw metal bolts in front of them to see where it's safe to walk, and use their detector to see if they're close to an artifact, which will only spawn in if you get close enough. The first detector you get seriously sucks ass, while the other ones you get later in the game clearly display the exact spots that are hazardous and the artifacts within them, kind of trivializing anomaly exploration by the end of the game. Artifacts have value other than monetary, however, and can be equipped by the player for stat bonuses at the expense of radiation poisoning, which can be negated by certain artifacts that reduce radiation poisoning. But because of the compounding damage radiation poisoning does, it's really not worth equipping artifacts until you get one that reduces the radiation buildup, which I didn't get until about 15 hours in. Whew, that was a mouthful. Does that sound like a lot to keep track of? Yeah, it's kind of a complicated game, and those are just the basics. There's plenty I left out for you to discover on your own. Now, let's talk about difficulty. This is a hard game, and you're most likely going to be mashing F5 like it's going out of style. Quick saving is your best friend, as death can come from many places, usually very quickly. It can be frustrating to die from something you didn't see coming and couldn't have really prevented, but it's even worse to lose an hour of progress at the same time. Certain things I mentioned a minute ago, like the lack of a good detector early on, the debatable usefulness of artifacts early on, and the less than stellar equipment choices early on, probably gives you an idea of what I'm gonna say next. The early game in Call of Pripyat can get you kinda pissed off at times. Alright, listen boss, I got a confession to make. I lowered the difficulty down to easy for the first third or so of the game after getting my asshole torn asunder for the dozenth time. It made it feel much more fair, and when I started to feel overpowered, I switched the difficulty back up to normal. Some people let their pride get in the way when it comes to enjoying hard games, but as far as I'm concerned, it's about having fun and being engrossed in the experience, and I had way more fun lowering and raising the difficulty as necessary to make it feel more balanced between the world and myself. Don't be afraid to do the same. Seriously, it's a single-player game after all. There's no leaderboards, no PvP, nothing to prove. While there's no official DLC for Call of Pripyat, the modding community sunk its claws deep into this one. There's a crazy amount of mods for this game, which range from cosmetics to bug fixes to complete overhauls. One in particular worth mentioning is called Misery, which is basically a total conversion that ramps up the realism and difficulty to 11, for those who like a more hardcore experience. If you get bored of the vanilla game, there's plenty of fan-made content to keep you busy, though I can definitely say in my playthrough I never once thought it needed to be modded, but that's just my opinion. S.T.A.L.K.E.R Call of Pripyat is what I would call a flawed masterpiece. So many cool and unique concepts are at work in the game, and the premise and atmosphere are so good, yet the experience can absolutely be hindered by technical issues, nitpicks, and questionable design choices. I'm actually not going to give this game a rating out of 10 because I feel like it's a highly subjective experience. I would put the game pretty close to a 10, but I tend to judge games more on their fun factor and personal experience. A different reviewer could give Call of Pripyat a 5 or 6 out of 10 and be completely justified, only because they instead focused on the game's shortcomings. It's going to be different for everybody who picks it up. So, rather than an out of 10 rating, I'll merely say this. If you're the kind of person who can overlook quirks in games and simply enjoy them for what they are, I implore you to give Call of Pripyat a try. Go in with an open mind. If it gets frustrating, save, put it down, and come back later and try again. And don't forget, there's no shame in playing on easy mode. S.T.A.L.K.E.R Call of Pripyat is a unique, rewarding, and mostly excellent experience that I'm sure you will not regret sinking some time into.